All right, hey everybody. Hope you are doing okay, hanging in there. Couple more weeks, and then it's summer, even though it doesn't feel like that. Um, this is going to be going through some notes looking at specifically carbon and how carbon cycles and the importance of carbon, and some general stuff about cycling. Okay, of course, everything's going to be trimmed way, way, way down. In class, we would have talked about water, phosphorus, nitrogen, carbon. Um, my dog is here and he wants attention. No, but you're fine. Um, there he is. So we're cutting it way, way down, right? Which stinks, but I'm sticking to some of the important bits. Okay. So, what I had you guys do this Monday, it's hard to remember what day it is and what day was what, but this Monday, I had you look at a website and it gives you all kinds of information about the composition of your body, what makes you up, and so on. And one of the questions I asked you was, how much of you is not carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, I think, CHONSP, right, or sponge? And the answer is not much. 1%-ish, something like that, right? So this first thing here, all living things are made of the same pieces. This is something I've been telling you for a long time. It's that all living things are made of the same basic elements, right? And the other key thing here, the second point, is that those pieces are always being recycled in our environment. So you've probably heard matter is never created or destroyed, and that's true. The stuff that makes up you and a tree and the air that we breathe and the soil and everything, it was not made for that thing. It's been here for a long time, right? Depending on what element that you're talking about. Um, the same goes for you, right? You're all special because of who you are and your personality and your life experiences. You are unique in that way, who you are as a person, but your physical makeup, you're nothing but carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus, and a few other little tidbits. That's about it. Um, and those things were not made to make you. How'd you get them? Well, you came from your mother, right? So, and she got the stuff to make you because the food that she ate. So she was getting it from plants and animals. They got it from their mothers, and then they got it from their mothers, and so on and so forth. Um, so the pieces that make you up were not made for you. Um, so there's that fact about cycles in our environment. So you are constantly adding to the cycles of nature. You are part of cycles of nature. You stole your atoms and nutrients from your mother, right? One day you will die, as we all will. And when you die, you don't take that stuff with you. The carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen, the blah, 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 will go back into the environment. No matter how tight of a coffin and how good of a coffin you make for yourself, um, eventually it's going to get back, right? And maybe that's creepy and weird. I think it's pretty cool, but you're borrowing it, so to speak. You're holding on to them for a little bit, and one day you're going to let them go, right? All the while you're not dead, you're contributing to the cycles. You're taking in food, you're breathing out CO2, mostly waste, urinating, defecating, getting rid of waste that way. It's just a constant cycle, right? Uh, always and always in a circle. Right? It has no beginning, it has no end, it's just always going. Okay? And I'm going to go a little faster through this. Okay? I'm going to have it here for review, but we've talked about this a little bit. The main, one of the most important pieces that makes you up of those main six is carbon. Because carbon is the building block of those most important parts of our cells. So here's nucleic acids, proteins, carbs, and fats. All of them are made of these things, and I've underlined carbon here because carbon is the real backbone of those molecules. Um, Oxygen, hydrogen, these other elements are really important. You can't have it without them. But the real structural pieces is carbon, the thing that actually gives it weight. Okay. And the reason for that is because of this Goldilocks that carbon is. And again, we've talked about this. It has just the right number of electrons the outside of its shell, or orbital, you've maybe heard it called, that it can form 4 covalent bonds on the outside. Right, here's carbon. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4. Boron, 1 left on the periodic table, has 3 on the outside. Nitrogen, 1 right on the periodic table, has 5, and it doesn't do as well. Carbon is this middle point that makes it really good at being a building block for life. There they are. Those are the electrons that I was talking about. And another thing, another Goldilocks part of carbon is that the bonds that they form, the covalent bonds that they form with other carbon molecules, or carbon atoms, is that they're strong, but they're not too strong, so that you can't just break them apart. So it holds things together really well. If we didn't have any bonds that were strong enough, then we wouldn't have matter as we would know it, solids, right? Maybe life could be a thing, but it wouldn't be anything like what it is that we have. So it's just all around a good building block. And the carbon cycle is fairly complicated. There's a lot of different things that go into the carbon cycle. If you take environmental science, we'll talk a lot about specifically fossil fuels and combustion and things like that, and how that relates to the carbon cycle. But if you look here, pretty simple showing of what the carbon cycle is. Let's look here where my cursor is. CO2 in the environment, right? You can trace that CO2 to plants via photosynthesis, which we'll look at in a second. Some of that CO2 goes into plants in the oceans as well. Those then are eaten by living things like us or other animals or whatever. Or when those things die, that carbon goes back into the either the soil or into the thing that ate it, like these cows right here. A lot of that carbon, when animals get rid of waste, is going to go back into the environment, into the grounds. We breathe out CO2, and so do other animals. So this arrow is going back to CO2 in the atmosphere, which can then go back to plants to photosynthesize, or back into the oceans, or whatever. Also, you've got things like humans extracting fossil fuels from the ground, which are basically fossilized trees, mostly. And we burn it, and that gives us energy, and that is released back in the atmosphere as CO2, and then CO2 can then blah, 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 right? There's no beginning, there's no end, it's always moving from piece to piece, okay? So the amount of carbon is not going up or going down, it is staying literally exactly the same, okay? And specifically, photosynthesis and respiration are 2 very closely related processes essential for this carbon cycle. Okay, and we've talked about these briefly, kind of, sort of. Here they are in more detail. Okay, photosynthesis, that's what plants do, right? We've talked about that a bunch. Photosynthesis, plants, it's a kind of a common knowledge thing, right? Happens in the organelle called a chloroplast. We talked about that with cells. It's what gives chloroplasts their green color. There's some cells here. These are little chloroplasts, these green circles here. What photosynthesis actually is, the equation, summarized, is this. Okay. Hopefully I'm not blocking this right now. Hopefully you can see it. If not, I'm uploading the notes as well. So CO2, which we have in the air, water, which we get obviously from precipitation from the sky, or it's being held under the soil from groundwater, but it got there from the sky anyway. Light then gives you the sugars that build up the plant, and then they release oxygen into the atmosphere that we end up using. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So one of the questions I asked you was, where does the mass of a tree come from? And a lot of you guys said things that I expected, like the soil, the seed, water, things that plants need. But all those things are actually mostly wrong. Okay? Those things contribute very small amounts to the mass of a tree. Most of the mass of a tree is carbon. Something like 50% of wood is carbon, depending on the species, something like that. And when you touch the wood, when you put your hand against a tree, what you're mostly touching is the carbon. Okay. And if you look here, a tree photosynthesizes via this equation. Where does the carbon come from? Might be good to use a pen. Okay. To the left of the equation here are the reactants, right? Where's the carbon coming from? Well, it's coming from, it's right there, right? Um, CO2, where does the CO2 come from? Well, it comes from the air. So what the tree is doing is through photosynthesis, taking the CO2 from the atmosphere, breaking the carbon and the two oxygens apart from each other, utilizing the carbon in the act of photosynthesis, building some of itself up, and releasing some of these other things as a byproduct, and building itself up. Okay, so this carbon is the same carbon over here. Okay, and I know it says sugar here, and that's partially true, but it's a little simplification. That's pretty much the plant itself, is this right here, is made of these things. So this carbon is coming from what? Carbon dioxide from the air. So where does the mass of a tree come from? It comes from the air. If you could put a tree in a big bubble from sapling to adult, big oak tree or something like that, and you could measure the air before and after, the air would be lighter, significantly lighter. If you measure the soil, it would be the same, pretty much the same. So trees grow out of the air, basically, which I think is really cool. And then if we take that tree and we chop it down and we burn it, we reverse this cycle and we get these things. Releases CO2 back in the atmosphere. Okay. Let's get this. The flip side of this is respiration. This is what we do. Here's a mitochondria right here, right? The kidney bean shaped guy that gives us our energy. This is the actor that's going through cellular respiration. And this is what we do, right? We don't photosynthesize. We get our energy through respiration. Okay, so the equation for this is right here. Ignore these sixes. Doesn't really matter. Okay. So we take in food, we eat sugars, right? We breathe in oxygen, and then as a byproduct, we put out CO2. That's what we're breathing out. Some excess water, most of which your body uses. Anything extra, you pee out. And then ATP, that magical molecule that gives us energy. And we've talked about ATP before, briefly. If you're curious, if you're wondering, like, what if you don't eat glucose? What if you're doing the keto diet and you don't eat any carbohydrates or an incredibly small amount? Simplification here, but cellular respiration can be done with something other than carbohydrates. It's a really complex, convoluted thing to show you. If you want to Google it, you can find it. It's very, very complicated. But in the absence of carbohydrates, our body can use other things to respire, particularly fats and proteins, because that's the only other thing that we have. Okay. So here it is. What's interesting is if you look at these side by side. Okay. Again, ignore the sixes and things. Top one is photosynthesis. Bottom one is respiration. Sorry, dog saw a rabbit. So the thing that makes up a plant, right there, that's sugar. A person then eats that, and if you don't eat plants, well, you eat animals that eat the plants. So you're getting that same thing no matter what, because those elements are not destroyed or created, they're just changing form. Okay, so that right there is the same thing as what's right here. So we are taking that on the top and using it here at the bottom. Plants give off oxygen, and that's the main reason why our atmosphere has oxygen in it, is because we have photosynthetic bacteria and algae and plants, trees, and so on that photosynthesize, and that's why there's so much oxygen. So that oxygen is this oxygen down over here. We then breathe out CO2, which plants can further use to make photosynthesis happen. We also get rid of a bunch of water, which plants will also then use, right? The ATP is for us, so they don't get any of that. But you can see how these are basically mirrors of each other. The reactants of one or the products of another are very similar to it. And that's no coincidence. These have been evolving together throughout the millennia, okay? Throughout the millions of years, billions of years actually, okay? So hopefully that helps you start to get an idea of how connected some of these molecules are, and how connected you are to the rest of the environment. We are not separate, right? You might think, well, yeah, I produce water as a byproduct, but I flush it down the toilet and then it goes in a tank and that's done. Well, that's not the case. All of our waste, all of the everything that we get rid of, doesn't matter where it goes, it finds its way back into the environment, no matter what, unless we shoot it off into space, which we don't do that. Okay. So there's going to be some questions about all this stuff. Please let me know if there's any questions that you have. Need help with it. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay. See you guys. And I'm sure there's a better way to close. So here we go. Stop recording.